We are talking about lies about being a Christian, and here's the lie about church that we're going to talk about this morning. Church is just a building or an event. It's a place that you go. It's a program, a conference, a concert that you see on a rhythmic rewind over and over again on Sundays. I hear this all the time in lots of different ways, and I want to push back against this lie this morning and show us that the truth is it's bigger than this, it's more beautiful than this, it actually is more challenging and costly of all of us to truly understand as well. The church, this is the lie, is just a building or an event. Man, it's so much better than that. And here's a thought I was thinking about last couple weeks as I was preparing for this. A lot of the things that we think about when we think about church, especially in this realm and in this way of thinking, a lot of things that we think about when we think about church, you can get in a lot of different places without coming to church or going to a building. If you want to get incredible Bible teaching, incredible sermons, I mean, right now at your fingertips from your phones, from your tablets, from your computers, you guys can sit at home and stream the best Bible teaching the world has probably ever seen on Sunday mornings in the comfort of your PJs, right? You can do that. You don't need to come to a church and hear like somebody like me or anybody else in our community if you just want to get great preaching, because it is out there on podcast, on demand. It's out there live streamed all over the world. I mean, you don't need to come to a building to get that stuff. If you love music, if you love the kind of music that our team leads us in, if you love church music, modern worship music, you actually, on your phone or on your computer or tablet, you can get all of those songs done by the original artists, check this out, at the volume that you actually like it. So if you think it's too loud here, you're like, let's just turn that down. If you think the lights are too much, you could be like, let's just dim the lights a little bit or just do the lights normal at home. You don't need to do anything if you just want to consume the music the way that you want to consume it. A lot of people say, like, well, church is about community and it's about friends. And so I go to this building or this event on Sunday mornings so that I can, like, see and have community and connect with people. But here's the reality. The format that we do church on Sunday mornings, it's really not that conducive to deep, long-lasting friendships and relationships. I mean, we don't sit in circles or at tables where we can see each other. We sit in rows when everybody's staring at my ugly mug all the time. Like, this is not really conducive to that. And if you really want friendships and connections, Sunday morning's not going to do it, but you know what will do it? There's like tons of apps that do it. And we have social media and social networks where you can actually connect with people that are like-minded to you in the political sphere, like-minded to you in your work or the hobbies that you like from all over the world. So if you think church is just an event where you can network, man, there are so many more efficient ways to do it. And I want to go out on a limb here and say, like, as we dive into this morning, if you were defining church just as a building or a service or a program or a concert or a conference that you attend on the weekends, man, you don't need that in your life. I'll tell you why you don't need that. Because you're too busy just to add another thing to your calendar. I know this. I mean, I know that you're so busy. Your calendars are filled to the brim of lots of different things, of taking kids all over the place and work and just trying to, like, look at your spouse in the eyes before you fall asleep at night. Like, you've got so many other things going on. You don't need another thing just to fill up space on your calendar. So if you're thinking church is just something that I go to on Sunday mornings, man, you don't need another thing at all. Another reason that you don't need church if you think it's just a building or an event you attend is that you should never be motivated by guilt or shame. And trust me, I have sat in lots of sermons in churches over my life where people have pulled out one verse out of its context in Hebrews and said that you need to go to church, you're sinning if you don't go to church. And like, we can talk about the theology behind that all that we want all morning. But the reality is, I never want you to be motivated by shame, fear, or guilt. I don't think anything good comes from that. I want you to come. I want you to want to come to church, but I'm never going to guilt you for not being at church a week or not coming to church. That's just not our thing. And I don't think you should be motivated by fear, shame, guilt for any decision that you make in your life. So if you're coming to church because of those reasons, man, you don't need it in your life. And just a side note before we go any further, some of you here this morning, or more likely some of you that are watching online, some of you have some church baggage. You've got some church hurt in your life, man. I know as I look out on faces, some of you guys, this is part of your story where you were deep into a community of faith and there was a leader or leadership let you down. There was maybe a divorce or there was a breaking up of a family and the church took sides and it got ugly and messy and so hurtful to you. I just want to say, if you're here or if you're joining us online, like, I am so sorry that the church hurt you the way that it did. All those stories, they rip my heart out of my chest. I am so terribly sorry that's been your experience. And I'm not going to make any defenses for it, but I'm so sorry about that. But what I want to do this morning is I want to pull back the curtain. I want to take a microscope and look at what church was always meant to be, what the first church actually was, and what I believe is to be an invitation to be not a subculture, but a counter-cultural movement that Jesus dreamed up as the church. And so whatever your baggage, your experience, whatever you've thought about what church is, man, come along with me this morning as hopefully we take a fresh look. And to do so, we're going to go into the New Testament. We're going to look at the very first time that the word church was ever used in the Bible. We've got all these pictures and all these images and all of 2,000 odd years of history to have our pictures of what church is really like. But let's go back to the root and the very first time that the word church is used. And I think you'll be surprised. And hopefully you'll just lean in to this subversive, challenging reality that Jesus lays out when he talks about the church. So we're going to be spending time first in the book of Matthew, which is not a book. It's actually an ancient biography of Jesus' life that's been recorded for us by eyewitnesses, and it's placed in our New Testament. And we're going to hang out in Matthew chapter 16 in this pivotal moment with Jesus and his disciples where Jesus talks about church for the very first time. So let's put this first part of this first verse up on the screen, chapter 16, verse 13. Jesus is traveling with his boys, his disciples. He said, when Jesus came to the region of Caesarea Philippi, and we've got to stop here because this is where we usually skip right through because it's like talking about some ancient place. But we got to stop here and talk about Caesarea Philippi. Who's pumped to talk about Caesarea Philippi up in here, right? This thing we always pass through, but we got to understand something about this region. You know, in the Hebrew tradition, in Hebrew history, which Jesus was a Jew, a Hebrew, in northern Israel during the Old Testament, it wasn't called Caesarea Philippi because it was before the Roman Empire, but it was this place in northern Israel where there was terrible idol worship to the god called Baal that was going on in the Old Testament. So much of the Old Testament is talking about the idol worship and the cult of Baal. Baal was a fertility cult, and so when anybody would worship Baal in the Old Testament, there'd be these lewd, terrible, violent sexual acts that would be a part of the worship of Baal. There was also the just heinous activity of child sacrifice that was commanded by Baal. So anybody who was trying to worship Baal, you had to offer up your first son as a sacrifice, or your first kid as a sacrifice to this evil idol and this evil idol worship that happened with Baal. And so this is just in the background of Jewish people. They hear about this region in northern Israel, and they're like, we shouldn't go there. Bad things happen there. Other writers would say it's kind of like hell on earth is what this place is like. And so we fast forward to Jesus and his disciples hanging out here. Now it's called Caesarea Philippi. And there's still heinous, terrible things that are happening in this region. But now the world's moved forward from those gods to the Greek gods. And they actually have this huge region inside of Caesarea Philippi that was all dedicated to the worship of Pan. And if you've ever seen like Greek gods, depictions of them, this is the Greek god who was like a man, but he had a goat head, like really handsome fella. And this is Pan, right? But Pan was also a fertility cult. He's part of the people that were saying like this is the god of sex and the god of intimacy in Greek mythology. But there would be terrible, terrible things that would happen. I mean, lewd sex acts. I mean, dark, dark things that would be oppressive sexually to women and oppressive sexually to men as well. There was child sacrifice that was still going on. And so Caesarea Philippi is this terrible, terrible place that many people considered hell on earth. And Jewish men and women were told, never go into this place. And so what does Jesus do? He walks up with his disciples right to Caesarea Philippi. And his disciples are shaking in their sandals because their mama told them never to go here because this is where bad things happen. This is hell on earth. Jesus brings them to this place, and I think Jesus did it intentionally, and he has a very stark conversation with his disciples. This is what happens next in the text. Verse 14. He asked his disciples, who do people say the Son of Man is? Son of Man is a phrase that Jesus is picking up to talk about himself from the Old Testament book of Daniel. Son of Man highlights the divinity and him being God, but also the humanity. Son of Man, he's a human as well. And Jesus is saying, who do people say that I am? And I imagine in this moment, it's just me reading between the lines, but there's kind of like everybody's looking around at each other like, oh, we're going there, aren't we? Who's going to be the one to pipe up first? What do we say? What's the right answer? We want to make sure Rabbi Jesus is happy, and this is what happens next. They replied, some say John the Baptist. Others say Elijah, and still others Jeremiah or one of the prophets. They're saying maybe people are saying you're one of those great heroes of our faith from the Old Testament. But Jesus turned it back on them. He says, what about you? He asked, who do you say I am? If you thought people were nervous first to talk about what other people thought about Jesus, this is when things get really intense. It gets personal. He's looking his disciples in the eyes, and he's like, who do you say that I am? And I imagine there's some awkward silence, people looking down at their sandals, like, we're not supposed to be here. And this is like, Jesus is asking us like 401 level questions, and I don't want to get it wrong. But I love what happens next because Simon Peter pipes up. And I love Peter. He's like one of my favorite disciples because he reminds me sometimes of myself. He is like a talk first, think about what you're saying second kind of person. He's a shoot, ready, aim kind of guy. And this is what Peter just jumps forward and he says here. In his response, Simon says, you are the Messiah, the Son of the living God. Jesus, you are not just a great teacher. You're not just a great prophet. You are the one that has been promised for generations to set the world right again, to bring hope, light, healing, and life. This is who you are, Jesus. And I imagine Jesus has let it hang for a little bit. He's like, oh, what's Jesus going to say? What's Jesus going to say? And then he responds like this. Like, ding, 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 ding. You're right, Peter. Way to go, man. Jesus replied, blessed are you, Simon, son of Jonah, for this was not revealed to you by flesh and blood, but by my Father in heaven. This is not something you just came up with because you're smart. This is something that God has revealed to you. And I tell you, Peter, Peter, and on this rock I will build my church, and the gates of Hades will not overcome it. And I tell you that you are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church, and the gates of Hades will not overcome it. This is the first time that the word church is used in the scriptures. And the word that Jesus uses for church here is not the word that you might assume. It's not the word used for a temple or a building. It's not the word used for a religious service. It's actually not even a religious word in the Greek language. It's the word ekklesia. On the count of three, can you guys say ekklesia with me? 1, 2, 3. Ekklesia. Ekklesia was actually a civic word used for Roman citizens. People, they would actually be called out from their homes to meet in a public space together, to form a gathering, an assembly, a community. And ekklesia in the first century, they would get together and they would discuss issues and problems in their community and how they could come together and move the ball down the field, to fix problems, to discuss things that deeply matter to them, their families, and their communities, and to move the ball down the field. People called out of their homes to a public place, and they're connecting together as a community, as a movement to make a difference. That is what ecclesia is. It's not a building. It's not a temple. It's not even a word considered for a religious service in the first century. It's people called out of their homes to gather together as a movement to fix problems, to move the ball down the field, to help their community. That's what ecclesia was. And we see here, what's interesting to me is like Jesus says here, and I tell you that you are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church. So if a church is not a building, it's a community of people, it's a movement of people that are called out of their homes to be together to fix problems. Jesus says, on this rock I will build that thing. And this is so fascinating to me because there's been so many rich theological discussions throughout church history about what is this rock that Jesus is talking about. Now, our Roman Catholic friends, they interpret this as Peter, you are the rock. Cephas, Peter, in the Greek, it's very similar, the language there. And so a lot of people think, well, it's because now Peter was the first pope, and through his leadership and apostolic succession, that's how God's going to build his church. And there are some merits to the reality that Peter is, by all accounts, a leader in the early church, for sure. But I'm not completely convinced that that's exactly what Jesus is talking about. There's a Protestant theological understanding about this idea of what the rock is, and most of the time, the theological understanding for Protestants is that this rock meant the confession that Peter made, like this confession that Jesus is the Messiah, the Son of the living God. That is the confession that will build the church, and I can get behind that as well. Theologically, I think it's beautiful. I think it's ultimately true. But I actually think there's more going on here than what meets the eye if we just read it on the surface. Ray Vander Laan is a historian, archaeologist, and a Bible teacher. And I learned from his teaching this last week, it just blew my mind. I could not shake this idea. He taught this, that Jesus was a rabbi. We can't forget he was a Jewish rabbi. And Jewish rabbis, in their teachings, they would never talk about something in the abstract, like us Westerners think in the abstract all the time. Jewish rabbis would either have to hold something in their hand they were talking about, or they'd have to be able to point to it. So Ray Vander Laan says that what Jesus is actually talking about when he says this rock is he's actually talking about the ground that he is standing on. Let's go, I want to show this picture of Caesarea Philippi here. You see, it's actually the community is on the base of a cliff. And so one of the ways that rock is understood in the ancient world is like a cliff face. And so it's very possible that Jesus and his disciples are standing right there at the cliff face. And then Jesus says, on this rock, I will build my church. Jesus is talking about where he is actually standing. This is wild, you guys. Have you guys picked up what Jesus is doing yet? Jesus is saying, in this place that's considered hell on earth, in this place where there is so much darkness and evil and oppression and sin and just hatred and exploitation of humanity, I'm going to build my community, my gathering, my assembly, my movement in the darkest kind of place on earth. I want you to know, my followers, Jesus is saying, that this church thing, we're not playing defense, we're playing offense, and we're going to go where the darkest things on planet Earth happen. We're not going to go to our nice suburban places and sit in our comfortable buildings and just be protected and be nervous about what's going on in the world. No, we're going to storm the world that might be considered hell on earth with the goodness of God. Let's go back to that verse one more time, because Jesus gives us a hint at this idea of the church being found and placed in the darkest places in life when he talks about the gates of Hades will not overcome it. Now, growing up, whenever I saw that phrase, gates of hell, gates of Hades, I always just, in my Western suburban way of thinking, I remember thinking, okay, that means that hell and the powers of darkness, like God's going to protect us from those things. But if you look at it on face value, why would Jesus be talking about that? And he would talk about the gates of Hades, the gates of hell. Gates are a defensive measure, aren't they? Jesus is actually saying that the church is not going to be like protected behind any kind of gates, but the church is more of a battering ram, an offensive measure to storm the darkest places and to say, do you think this is the way the world is when evil is running the world? No, the church opens up our imagination to a world where Jesus is in charge. And the gates of Hades, the gates of darkness and hell have no chance against the church. So here we are. 2021, there's billions of Jesus followers gathered in churches all over the place. And I want us to ask the question, how did we get here? How did it get to this small movement of uneducated Jewish men led this movement that spread all over the world? I mean, did this happen because Jesus followers got in bed with politics? By saying you have to vote for this person or God's activity on earth can't happen? It's because Jesus followers, they got really rich and so they used their influence from all the wealth that they had? Was it because they used violence or coercion to convince people that you either trust Jesus or you die? Is that how we got here today? No, not at all. We got here today and the church is still alive and active because it was marked by the life and the way of Jesus. And the early church, the early gathering community of Jesus followers stormed wherever there was hell on earth with the presence of heaven. And the early church, the early community of Jesus followers, they radically did this. They saw the image of God on every child in a community and in a culture where children were exposable, where you waited 8 days even to name your kid because you weren't sure if you wanted to keep your kid, especially if they were a little girl. The early church said, no, bring the little children to me, because that's what Jesus said. So they started orphanages. The early church saw women, and women during this time were completely disposable. They weren't allowed to have education. They weren't allowed to work. They were just a secondary citizen. And they saw Jesus' example of women like funding his ministry and serving alongside of him, and Jesus calling them his disciples. And they said, no, women should be elevated, and they matter so much. This is what the early church did. The early church had a new sexual ethic and a culture that said, if I can have sex with you, especially as a man, I should be able to, and I will force myself upon you to make this happen. The early church flipped this upside down, and they said, no, I'm going to honor your body, and I'm going to honor my body. And it's going to be a whole new sexual ethic, which during the Roman Empire was radical, and no one had ever heard about honoring the other person, even if you were stronger than them. Nobody had ever heard about that. They took what Jesus said when Jesus said, love the Lord your God with all your heart, mind, soul, and strength, and they zeroed in on that mind thing. They zeroed in on that mind thing and like, you know what? We need more people to like be literate and to understand the world and to get education. And so, it was Christians who started universities. Almost every Ivy League school in America, it's hard to imagine it now, but they were started by Jesus followers that said we need to teach and we need people to understand the world and to stretch their minds to all that God made it to be. This the way of Jesus, it went into medicine and healthcare. They saw that Jesus healed people not only of their spiritual ailments, but of their physical ailments. And Jesus followers, they're like, we need to do the same kind of thing. And when there were crises that happened in human history, they actually ran to the crisis, not out of the crisis. There's a church historian by the name of Eusebius. And Eusebius actually was a leader and a historian in the church when there was a pandemic. Hard to believe this happened in other times, right? There was a pandemic in the ancient world. And they were describing this terrible plague that was going through Rome. But they have this great moment in Eusebius' history where he explains how Christians showed up. He said this is written in the 4th century. All day long, Christians tended to the dying and to the burial of countless numbers with no one to care for them. Others gathered together from all parts of the city, a multitude of those withered from famine, and distributed bread to them all. As a result, check this out, the Christians' deeds were on everyone's lips, and they glorified the God of the Christians. Oh, isn't that beautiful? Christians didn't play the defense. They didn't just retreat, but they said, how can we help? How can we go and alleviate suffering? Because this is what our leader, this is what our rabbi, this is what our Savior, Jesus, did. The early church broke down social barriers, socioeconomic barriers, and said, hey, are you hungry? Are you hungry for the truth? Are you hungry for a new way of life that will bring you healing and life and hope? Oh, come to Jesus. It doesn't matter what your background is. It doesn't matter what your story is. It doesn't matter what the color of your skin is. It doesn't matter what your gender is. Come to Jesus. He is for you. And it changed the face of the earth. It wasn't playing defense. It was playing offense, storming, even in the darkest places, storming hell on earth with the presence of heaven. Now, another reality of what I believe the church is called to be is this community that they live in a way that is so countercultural but so beautiful and so needed that I think the world takes notice. It's not just in their actions, but in the way that they live life together. When I think about the way the church is supposed to live life together, I think about the redwood forest and the redwood trees. Have any of you guys ever been to Northern California and seen the redwood forest? Yeah, some of you guys have. I haven't, and I really want to, especially after learning some of this stuff, because redwood trees are crazy. Check out this picture of a redwood tree. Here's a couple kids in front of it. That's one tree, you guys. We don't have that in our parks here in Kokomo at all. But that's one tree. I learned so much about redwood trees. They're really, really tall, 375 feet tall on average. 40% of the water that they drink is from drinking fog. That's how high they are up in the air. They're old. They're oldest trees are 2,000 years old. And their bark, it's disease resistant. It's bug resistant. It's actually even fire resistant. So much of our technology about fire resistance comes from the bark of a redwood tree. They're actually drought resistant as well. Inside of their trunks and inside of their root system, they can store 8,000 gallons of water. And they grow rapidly, 3 times faster than other trees. Now, here's a picture of a redwood forest here. To see all these big trees, how high they go. Again, 40% of their water comes from drinking fog. Now, we might think these trees are so powerful that their roots must go down deep, hundreds of feet into the earth. But the reality is that they don't go down that deep. They actually only go down 9 to 12 feet into the ground. But you know what they do? They go out to the left and the right, hundreds and hundreds of feet, and they interlock, they interconnect with other roots of redwood trees, and they're so connected together. I mean, scientists are discovering crazy things about the interconnectivity of redwood trees. They're discovering that if one tree isn't doing well and it's not healthy, somehow they send a signal to the other trees through their interlocked roots, and then the other trees send them nutrients and send them water so that they can survive. It's crazy, right? And here's another thing. You can't plant redwood trees by themselves. They need each other. If you just plant one redwood tree, it's going to fall down and die in no time at all. They need each other. But when they stand together, man, they can withstand any storm, any drought, any weather, anything that happens. And when I think about the church and the way that we're called to live life together, I think about redwood trees because we're called to be connected and living together. Andy Stanley, a great pastor and mentor of mine from afar, he says this, that the church is called to be this. The church is a community of one anothering one another. We're not just a service where the church is not just a place that you go, but it's a community of people who one another. Now, in the New Testament, there's actually a word for one another. It's a Greek word for the word one another. It's found over 110 times just in the New Testament alone, and it's the word alelon. Alelon. It looks a little bit like this in the Greek, and it means one another, reciprocally, mutually. And alelon is a word that characterized the early church, and I believe it's supposed to characterize us as well, but it was so countercultural, it was so radical, it was so ahead of the rest of the time, and I think it still is today. To one another. This was an idea that was radical to people inside of the church, to outsiders, because it said to outsiders, you're not just a member of your tribe. I'm supposed to love you and bless you and serve you, and I want to be this for you. But inside of the church, it was even more radical because there were people from all different tribes and all different genders and socioeconomics that would come together, and they were called to one another, saying like, oh, I will carry you, I will pray for you, I will be with you, and you'll do the same for me in this mutuality. In a world where it was if might equals right, and if I'm stronger than you, I don't need to do anything for you, alelon, one another, was radical. I want to walk through just a few of the different ways you and I, inside of the church, are called to alelon one another. We're called to encourage one another. Paul writes in 1 Thessalonians this, therefore encourage one another, build each other up, just in fact as you are doing. You know what encourage means in the original language? Encouragement is this idea that you see a person for the image of God on their life. Not the external things, but you see the person with the image and the purpose of God in their life, and you speak it into them. Even when they can't see it themselves, to encourage them is to say, I see God's thumbprint on your life. I see the purpose and the gifting and the skill that God's given you, and this is who you are, so become this person. This is where the idea of when you tell people this, it fills them with courage. You encourage them. Right now, our 2-year-old Jack, we're not going to say he's going through his terrible twos, but he is so strong-willed. He is so defiant. His favorite thing is to look me in the eyes and be like, no, mommy. I'm like, okay, bro, I'm just here to help. Like, no, mommy. But it's so funny. I think about how I can encourage him because my wife and I, we talk all the time. We don't want to squelch his spirit. We don't want to squelch his strong nature and his strong belief in himself. We actually want to channel that into listening to mom and dad, but also be a leader. Be self-sufficient. You can do this. And that's what I think of when I think of encouragement. It's not squelching people for who they are, but to see oh, this is how God made you, and I want you to see it and channel it into the direction of what God's called you to be. We're called to encourage one another in this way. Here's the next idea here, another alelon to one another. Be kind and compassionate to one another, forgiving each other just as Christ forgave you. You know what kindness is? Kindness, you guys, I say this a lot, but it's so much bigger than niceness. We do niceness in the Midwest real good. But nice is it's nothing compared to kindness. You know what kindness is? It's seeing somebody living in a way that's different than you, that you would not choose, that you might not agree with, but instead of you throwing judgment at them, it has you take a step back and get curious and ask questions. Why do you act that way? Why do you see the world this way? Maybe somebody hurt you. Maybe there's something I can do to help. It's you withholding your rock of judgment and getting curious and asking questions and slowing down and being kind to them. Another idea of kindness is this: instead of reminding somebody else of their weakness, it's actually letting them borrow your strength. It's seeing somebody in a low place, and instead of saying, oh, you know why you're down there, here's this Bible verse, here's this, that. No, it's just letting them borrow your strength. It's leveraging your strength for the lesser party. Ooh, isn't that better than niceness? That's what we're called to do for one another, is to be kind to one another. Then we're called to be compassionate as well. The Hebrew word for compassion is interesting because it's the same word for the womb. And so to be compassionate is to be very wombish, if you will. It's to be protective of what God has birthed into this world and what God is birthing into this world. It's to be protective and to care for them so much that you actually hold them tightly in protection. You know, compassion is so much different than sympathy. I like to say that compassion is empathy in action. I can watch This Is Us on TV, and I can feel real bad. I'm, the Pearsons, why? Jack, you're the best. I can do that, but what does it do? I mean, do I do anything with it outside of feeling bad? That's not compassion. Compassion is not just sympathy but feeling bad, but it's you feeling what they feel and then you moving in action to be a blessing, to say that you are going to be okay because I'm going to step in for you. We're called to be wombish, to be compassionate and kind to other people. Another thing that Paul encourages us to do is to carry each other's burdens. He says this in the book of Galatians. He says, carry each other's burdens, and in this way, you will fulfill the law of Christ. I think so many of us, when we approach church, we come to it thinking, I'm going to try to get something for me from the message this week. It's going to fill me up as I go into my Monday. But man, church is not a solo sport. Church is a lot more like football and basketball than it is tennis and golf. He says, Paul says here that you're just called to carry each other's burdens. And there are a couple things that are deep inside of this. One, we have to recognize that we all have burdens. And we've got to be humble enough to say that I can't carry things on my own. Oh man, that's hard for me. Is that hard for you? Just like to admit, like, man, this is heavy. I can't do this on my own. I need help. That's part of what carrying each other's burdens is. The other thing is to have your eyes scanning, to know people, to read their cues, to be like, how can I carry your burden? How can I lighten your load? This is what the church is supposed to do. And we're to elalon this to one another, this idea of carrying each other's burden. Here's the last one I want to look at. We're called to forgive one another. Paul writes in Colossians, bear with each other and forgive one another if any of you has a grievance against someone. Forgive as the Lord forgave you. My friends, the church was invented, was created, was inaugurated to be a community of radical and liberal forgiveness over and over again. We're supposed to be marked by this idea of forgiveness. And this is offensive to people wherever you are on the political spectrum, wherever you fall in the latest hot topic issue of the day, because right now it's popular in our culture to not even talk about forgiveness, but we just need to cancel people. Go away. You did something wrong. Go away and never come back. And then other people say, well, there's not really a big deal with what they did. I mean, everybody makes mistakes, and so we should just move on. But forgiveness does two things that radically oppose both of those ideas. Forgiveness says, yes, there was something wrong. You hurt me. You did wrong. And we're going to deal with what you did by offering you forgiveness and a pathway of reconciliation and restitution for you to come back into the fold. And my friends, this is what radically shaped the church, and this is what radically could shape the church again today. Don't just hold on to resentment or bitterness. I love this quote from Anne Lamott who says that holding bitterness or a grudge is like drinking rat poison and waiting for the other person to die. Jesus wants to give you freedom, and he wants you to be a part of the church that is a radical beacon of forgiveness in our world. So let it go, don't hold it back anymore. That's Saint Elsa, right? This is what the church was called to be. And just one last thought on this idea of us all being connected together, a community of elalon, one another. I had a Bible professor in college tell me this, that every time you see the word you in the New Testament, the word you is not actually the singular you, like, hey, you, John, or hey, you, Billy, or hey, you, Stephanie. No, it's actually a plural word. So the word you, every time you read it in the New Testament, it's not you, it's y'all. It's more Leonard Skinner, more country song than it is you, right? Because everything that we are called to do, challenged to do, is for a community of people to live out together. Let me just ask you this. Like, can you imagine if when people talked about Bridgeway, talked about our little church here, that maybe they were skeptical about what we taught and what we believed, and they can't get their head around the death and the resurrection of Jesus, but they're envious of the way that we treat other people on the outside and how we treat each other on the inside of our church. Can you imagine if they're skeptical about what we believe, but man, they're like, there's something to this. Because look at the way they love one another. Can you imagine when people think about our church, they think not of a building or a cool service or a great band, but they think about a group of people that storm the evils of this world. They listen to their community and the cries of their community, and they gather together to do something about it. That there is a group that make a priority in their lives to give themselves away to serve other people. Not just about us and our families, but we make it a rhythm of our life to give ourselves away to serve others. Can you imagine if they saw a group of people who don't white-knuckle their rights, saying, oh, this is me, this is mine, I've got to fight for my rights, but instead of white-knuckling their rights, they look to do right by their neighbors, no matter if they're gay, straight, Democrat, Republican, Patriots fan, everybody at the table. Can you imagine when they see and think about Bridgeway, they think about this is people that serve one another, value others above themselves, they carry each other's burdens. This is a group that practices forgiveness so much that they're a little weirded out by it. It's crazy. It makes people uncomfortable, but somehow inside of their uncomfortable state, they lean in and they just wonder, is this Jesus really true? It's almost too good to be true. Can you imagine, like if people talk about the church, they don't think about a service, but they think, this is a group that I want to be a part of. They say, I have a space at the table. And man, they're doing something. They're making a difference. My friends, church is more than an event or in a building. It's an invitation to ecclesia, to gather together, to storm the things of hell on this earth with the light and the life of heaven. And it's a challenge. It's an invitation to lay on one another. My friends, it changed the world once. And I think it can again. And it's an invitation for us to see the world outside of our windows and not to be afraid, but to see it as a beautiful, divine opportunity to be a part of the solution. And that's the invitation.